In the summer of 1979, a family of four climbed into their car and vanished. No trace, no witnesses, no goodbye. For decades, investigators pinned theories on the board. A father with hidden debts, a mother with secrets she never told her, friends, two children who never made it to school again. Some said they ran away, others whispered about foul play, and one rumor never died, that the river was hiding the truth. 30 years later, when a rusted car was pulled from the water, the case finally cracked open, but what it revealed was darker than anyone imagined. In the summer of 1979, the Parker family lived in a modest two-story home on the edge of town. To most who knew them, they seemed like the very picture of an ordinary American family. The father, Richard Parker, was 39 years old, a man who had worked nearly his entire adult life at the local manufacturing plant. His wife, Linda, was 35, a homemaker who balanced her days between raising their two children and volunteering part-time at the town library. Their kids, 12-year-old Anna and 9-year-old Michael, were lively, curious, and inseparable, known to ride their bikes around the cul-de-sac until the sun dipped below the horizon. The Parkers weren't wealthy, but they lived comfortably. Enough. Their yellow sedan, a car Richard took great pride in, was parked each night in the gravel driveway. Their mailbox still bore the fading stenciled letters of their last name. In the evenings, neighbors often recalled seeing Richard mowing the lawn while Linda watered the garden, the children darting around with a soccer ball or chasing fireflies in the muggy twilight. They seemed like a family grounded in routine, bound by love and the rhythms of small-town life. That summer, however, was different. The late 1970s brought a mix of economic strain and cultural change. Factories in the region were cutting hours. Whispers of layoffs spread through town, and neighbors who had known each other for years were now quietly locking their doors at night. Some families were moving away, chasing better opportunities elsewhere. For the Parkers, these shifts were subtle but noticeable. Richard had been coming home later, often tired and withdrawn. Linda's friends noticed that she seemed more distracted, sometimes leaving sentences unfinished, her mind drifting to some worry she never voiced aloud. On the night of June 14th, the family of four was last seen alive. It had been an ordinary Thursday. Anna had spent the afternoon at a friend's house, returning just before dinner. Michael had been pestering his father to fix the chain on his bike. Linda had prepared her usual casserole, setting the dish to cool on the counter before they headed out. The Parkers were planning to visit Richard's sister across town. At around 7:30 p.m., neighbors saw the family climb into their car. Richard was behind the wheel. Linda carried a bag of leftovers for his sister. Anna and Michael bickered briefly over who got the window seat in the back. The car rolled slowly down the street, its headlights cutting across the rows of houses as the last of the evening sun slipped away. And then, nothing. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. When Richard's sister was asked later, she said she had been expecting them. She had prepared coffee and set extra chairs around the table. But as the hours passed, she began to worry. She called their home phone, but no one answered. By 10 p.m., she called again, this time letting it ring for nearly a full minute. Finally, she assumed they had simply changed their minds or been delayed. It wasn't until the next morning, when their car was still absent from the driveway, and Richard hadn't shown up for work, that alarm bells began to ring. By noon the following day, neighbors were gathered on the sidewalk, exchanging nervous glances. Linda's best friend, Margaret, stopped by and knocked repeatedly at the front door, peering through the curtains into the darkened house. The casserole dish still sat untouched on the counter. Anna's schoolbooks were spread out on the kitchen table, her handwriting frozen mid-sentence in an unfinished math problem. Michael's baseball glove rested by the front door. It was as if the family had vanished in the middle of their lives, leaving everything behind. Police were called by late afternoon. Officers searched the house first, carefully walking through each room, checking for signs of struggle. But there was nothing. Beds made, closets neatly arranged, dishes drying on the rack. It looked like a home waiting for its family to return, but the Parkers never came back. Over the coming days, missing persons posters appeared on telephone poles and shop windows. The local paper ran the headline, "Family of 4 mysteriously vanishes." Volunteers scoured fields, back roads, and wooded areas. Search parties waded into shallow creeks, carrying flashlights as if they might stumble across some overlooked clue. Every night, the news carried the story, and every night, viewers went to bed unsettled, wondering how an entire family could simply disappear. The Parker house stood quiet. The yard grew untidy, the grass reaching higher each week. Neighbors, once hopeful, began to exchange darker theories in hushed tones. Something terrible had happened. But what? And so, from that evening in June of 1979, the mystery of the Parker family began. A mystery that would hang over the town for 3 decades, until a rusted car pulled from a river revealed the chilling truth of what had really happened that night. The first 2 days after a disappearance are often the most critical. In the case of the Parker family, those hours were filled with confusion, fear, and a desperate search for answers. By the morning of June 15th, the absence of Richard at the manufacturing plant raised immediate concern. Richard was not the kind of man to skip work without explanation. He was punctual, methodical, and known for his reliability. When his foreman noticed he had neither called in sick nor arrived for his shift, he phoned Richard's home. No answer. He tried again an hour later. Still nothing. At nearly the same time, Linda failed to appear at the library where she volunteered twice a week. The head librarian assumed she had been delayed with the children, but when she didn't arrive by late morning, she called the house as well. Again, the phone rang endlessly. By early afternoon, Richard's sister, the one who had expected them the night before, could no longer ignore the unease gnawing at her. She drove to their house, knocking on the door and peering through the windows. The casserole dish from the previous evening remained on the counter, now cold and untouched. The sight unsettled her. She called the police. When officers first arrived at the Parker residence, they treated it as a welfare check. A missing family, yes, but perhaps there was a logical explanation. They knocked, then circled the house. Nothing was out of place. The curtains were drawn, the grass freshly mowed, the front porch swept clean. It looked lived in, ordinary. Yet the deeper they stepped inside, the more unsettling it became. The children's backpacks sat by the door, ready for the next day of school. Anna's shoes were still tucked beneath the couch. Michael's baseball glove rested on the stairs. There was no sign of a hurried departure, no indication they had packed for a trip. Everything suggested they had expected to return that very night. The officers expanded their search. They called hospitals, checked accident reports, and radioed to surrounding counties. If there had been a car crash, they reasoned, surely someone would have seen it. But no reports matched the Parkers' yellow sedan. By that evening, the case was escalated. More officers canvassed the neighborhood. They knocked on doors, asking what neighbors had seen the night before. Several recalled the Parkers leaving around 7:30 p.m., Richard at the wheel, Linda in the passenger seat, the kids in the back. Beyond that, no one knew where they had gone. Search teams were assembled. Volunteers gathered at the local firehouse with flashlights and dogs. They spread into the nearby woods and fields, combing through tall grass and abandoned sheds. Others drove the back roads, headlights sweeping across gravel lanes and country fences. Yet not a single trace of the Parkers surfaced. As the first night fell, a heavy stillness settled over the town. For those who had known the family, the neighbors who had waved at them from across the street, the classmates who had played with Anna and Michael just days earlier, it felt impossible. How could 4 people, bound together by the routines of daily life, vanish without leaving a single footprint? By the second day, media attention began to mount. Local reporters crowded outside the police station, microphones ready, their cameras pointed toward detectives who offered little more than the investigation is ongoing. The town newspaper ran with the headline, "Family of 4 missing, no leads in search." At the Parker home, relatives gathered on the porch, their faces drawn with worry. Linda's parents arrived from 2 towns over, clutching photographs of their daughter and grandchildren. They spoke with reporters, their voices trembling as they pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. Richard's brother stood off to the side, chain-smoking cigarettes, staring blankly at the driveway where the family car should have been. Inside the station, detectives began constructing timelines. They pinned photographs of the family to corkboards, drew lines between their last known locations, and scribbled notes about possible leads. Theories began to form, some pointing toward foul play, others toward a voluntary disappearance. But with no physical evidence, each theory felt like chasing shadows. By the evening of the second day, frustration and fear had settled deep into the investigation. No ransom call had been made. No sightings had been confirmed. The car was still missing. It was as though the Parkers had driven into the night and dissolved into thin air. And in that silence, the absence of answers, the unanswered questions, piling higher each hour, the mystery of the missing family began to consume not just the investigators, but the entire town. By the third day of the Parker family's disappearance, the case had already begun to weigh heavily on the shoulders of the investigators. What had started as a missing persons report was now being treated with the gravity of something far darker. An entire family, a father, a mother, and 2 children, had vanished without a trace, and every hour that passed made it less likely that they would be found safe. Detectives began to pull apart the Parkers' lives piece by piece, searching for cracks beneath the image of a wholesome suburban family. They started with Richard, the father. On the surface, he was steady, a dependable worker at the plant, who had put in years of hard labor without complaint. Yet when his supervisor was interviewed, a different picture began to emerge. The late 1970s had been unkind to many industries, and the factory where Richard worked was no exception. Hours were being cut, and rumors of layoffs were spreading across the floor. Richard had recently confided to a coworker that he feared his position would be next. There were also whispers about money, bills piling up, a mortgage payment already past due. The detectives quietly reached out to the family's bank. What they uncovered only deepened their concern. The Parkers had been living paycheck to paycheck, their account often dipping into overdraft. A loan application had been filed just months earlier and rejected. To some investigators, the possibility arose that Richard, overwhelmed by financial stress, might have done something desperate. But others pushed back. Friends described him as proud, even stubborn, but not a man who would abandon his family, let alone harm them. Still, the notion of mounting debt hung over the investigation like a dark cloud. Attention then turned toward Linda. Those closest to her were quick to describe her as gentle, soft-spoken, the kind of mother who never missed a school recital, and always made time to bake cookies for neighborhood children. But friends also admitted she had seemed distracted in the months leading up to the disappearance. One confidant recalled Linda confessing, in a quiet moment over coffee, that she sometimes wondered what her life might have been like if she hadn't settled down so young. It wasn't a declaration of wanting to leave Richard, at least not directly, but it revealed a restlessness that investigators couldn't ignore. Another friend swore Linda had been spotted talking with a man at the library more than once, a man no one could later identify. That thread, though thin, was tugged on repeatedly by detectives who wondered whether an affair or secret relationship might explain the family's sudden vanishing. And then there were the children. 12-year-old Anna was bright, already, dreaming of becoming a teacher, while 9-year-old Michael lived for baseball, his mitt practically an extension of his hand. Detectives spoke with their teachers, classmates, and friends, searching for anything unusual in the days leading up to June 14th. What they found was heartbreaking in its ordinariness. Anna had been excited for summer vacation. Michael had been practicing his swing for the local Little League team. Nothing suggested they had run away or had been taken from their routines willingly. The lack of evidence was maddening. No broken glass at the home, no signs of struggle, no witnesses who had seen the car after it left their neighborhood. The detectives began to widen their net, looking into anyone who might have had reason to harm the family. Richard's co-workers were questioned extensively. Some spoke of him as a man burdened by stress, while others hinted at arguments with a supervisor. But there was nothing concrete, no threats, no clear enemies. Meanwhile, Linda's quiet. Life seemed, on paper, almost impenetrable. She had no known debts in her own name, no history of trouble with the law, and no behavior that raised alarms. And yet, as the detectives scribbled down theories on their caseboard, the idea lingered. What if she had wanted out? What if she had orchestrated something they hadn't yet uncovered? Theories piled up, but facts remained elusive. The car, that yellow sedan, became the focal point of every conversation. Where had it gone? How could a vehicle simply vanish without being seen on any road or bridge? Officers checked with neighboring counties, logging countless hours calling patrol units to see if an abandoned car had turned up. Nothing. They questioned gas station attendants along the main highways, asking if they remembered seeing the Parkers' car that night. Not a single lead surfaced. As the hours stretched into days, frustration boiled beneath the surface of the investigation. Some detectives leaned toward the idea of foul play, that the family had been intercepted by someone on the road, taken against their will. Others considered the possibility of a voluntary disappearance, a choice made by Richard or Linda to leave their old life behind. Each theory had its supporters and detractors, but none had evidence strong enough to tip the scales. For the town, the silence was deafening. Each night, families locked their doors a little earlier, whispered to one another about what could have happened. Parents held their children a little tighter, warning them not to wander too far. The Parker home, once filled with laughter and routine, now stood like a monument to absence. The porch light flickered on automatically each evening, casting a lonely glow on an empty driveway. By the end of that first week, detectives had little more than shadows and speculation. The Parker family's smiling photographs hung on the walls of the police station, pinned beneath pushpins and red lines connecting theories that led nowhere. What had happened to Richard, Linda, Anna, and Michael? The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered, gnawing at the edges of everyone's thoughts. And as the days bled into weeks, the town began to realize this was no ordinary case. This was a mystery that would not be solved easily, if it could be solved at all. As the investigation stretched into its second week, detectives found themselves circling back to the person at the center of so many unanswered questions, Linda Parker. She was, by all accounts, a devoted wife and mother, someone who rarely stepped outside the predictable rhythm of her days. And yet, when friends and acquaintances were asked to recall her behavior in the months before the disappearance, certain details emerged that gave investigators pause. Linda had always been well-liked in the community. She volunteered at the library, attended church on Sundays, and was known for dropping off baked goods at neighbors' homes. But several women who had spent time with her during those years admitted that she had seemed different lately. Margaret, her closest friend, recalled a conversation in which Linda admitted she sometimes felt trapped. Not trapped in a way that suggested danger or abuse, more like a woman who had married young and spent over a decade raising children, wondering if the life she had chosen was all there would ever be. Another acquaintance told detectives that Linda had once hinted at taking the children and leaving town for a while, though whether she meant permanently or just as a passing dream was unclear. It was the kind of comment that might have been brushed off under normal circumstances, but in the wake of her disappearance, it became a chilling thread for investigators to tug on. More troubling still was a rumor that began to surface about Linda spending time at the library with a man no one could later identify. Some claimed to have seen her speaking with him quietly, away from the circulation desk, leaning in as if their conversations were personal. Others dismissed it as nothing more than polite chatter between strangers. But in the hands of detectives, desperate for leads, it became another point of suspicion. Could Linda have been carrying on a secret relationship? Could she have planned to run away with this man, taking her children with her and leaving Richard behind? Richard's relatives were quick to bristle at such suggestions. To them, Linda was loyal, faithful, the backbone of the family. They insisted she would never abandon her husband, let alone put Anna and Michael through such trauma. but others weren't so sure. Richard's sister, who had been waiting for them that night, admitted that she and Linda had never been particularly close. She described her sister-in-law as polite but distant, guarded even. When pressed by detectives, she allowed that she could imagine Linda wanting something more out of life. The police did their best to follow these threads. They scoured library records, checked sign-in sheets, and tried to track down anyone who might match the description of the mysterious man. Nothing concrete surfaced, and yet the idea lingered. Every time detectives sat down with their case files, they couldn't help but picture Linda's quiet smile, her eyes cast downward, her voice confessing to a friend that she wondered what her life might have been if she had chosen differently. As weeks dragged on with no sign of the family's car and no ransom demand, the suspicion around Linda grew stronger. Detectives debated in hushed conversations behind closed doors. What if Linda had been the one to set events in motion? What if she had convinced Richard to drive that night under false pretenses? Or worse, what if she had left him entirely, vanishing with the children to start a new life under a different name? To the public, the case remained a mystery. But inside the station, pins and string began to circle tighter around Linda's photograph. It wasn't proof, not yet, but in the absence of evidence, suspicion became its own kind of truth. And yet, just as investigators began to focus their attention more sharply on her, other pieces of the puzzle emerged, pointing in entirely different directions. Theories shifted again, this time toward the idea that Richard himself might have been hiding secrets darker than anyone had realized. While suspicion lingered around Linda, detectives knew they couldn't ignore the other half of the marriage. Richard Parker was, on the surface, the kind of man towns like theirs were built on. He had put in long shifts at the local plant for nearly 2 decades, never once walking off the job or refusing overtime. To his co-workers, he was a dependable presence, a man who might not smile much, but who showed up, did his work, and went home. He was rarely seen at bars, never caught up in fights, and hardly ever mixed into town gossip. But the quiet, stoic kind of man Richard was also made him difficult to read. Beneath that hard-working exterior, detectives wondered what else might have been hiding. When investigators pressed deeper into his financial history, troubling details began to surface. The Parkers' bank account had been overdrawn multiple times in the months before the disappearance. Utility bills were paid late, sometimes stacked in piles on the kitchen counter. And then there was the mortgage. The family was several months behind, and foreclosure notices had already been sent out. Richard's co-workers told detectives he often carried the weight of money problems like an anchor around his neck. One remembered him snapping in frustration at a machine that jammed, something out of character for a man known for his patience. Another recalled Richard sitting alone in the break room, staring at a slip of paper, a bill, perhaps, his brow furrowed, his lips moving as if he were silently calculating how to make ends meet. The possibility crept into the investigation that Richard had been under far greater financial stress than anyone realized. And in cases like this, detectives knew desperate men sometimes made desperate choices. But the financial troubles were only part of the picture. Richard's own family members were divided when it came to his character. His brother defended him fiercely, describing him as stubborn but loyal, a man who would never turn his back on his children. But others were less certain. His sister, who had been waiting for the Parkers that night, confessed to police that Richard had always had a darker side, a temper that simmered just beneath the surface. He wasn't violent, she insisted, but she had seen him raise his voice, slam doors, and let his frustrations spill over when life pressed too hard. The image of Richard as a quiet, steady provider began to fracture. Some detectives now wondered if Richard might have been the orchestrator of the family's vanishing. Could he have staged it? Could he have driven them away from town that night? Not with the intention of visiting his sister, but with something else in mind entirely. Adding to this theory were whispers of gambling. At least 2 co-workers suggested that Richard had, on occasion, been seen at a card table in a smoky back room, above one of the local taverns. There were no records to prove it, and none of the tavern owners admitted to anything when questioned. But the idea that Richard had fallen into quiet debts he couldn't repay took hold among the investigators. If he had borrowed money from the wrong people, it could explain everything. The sudden disappearance, the lack of contact, the missing car. At the same time, others close to Richard bristled at such suggestions. His parents, still alive at the time, insisted their son was being maligned. He had worked himself to the bone for his family, they argued. He wasn't perfect, but he loved his wife and children. To them, the thought of Richard leading them into harm was unthinkable. Still, detectives could not ignore the mounting circumstantial evidence. Financial ruin, possible debts, a temper, and a quietness that made his inner life a mystery, even to those who thought they knew him best. On the caseboard at the station, Richard's photograph now bore a circle of red string around it, lines, leading to debts, gambling, and domestic tension. And yet, for all the theories surrounding him, there was still no proof, no body, no vehicle, no witness who could place him anywhere other than the last sighting as he pulled the family car onto the street that evening. It was as though Richard Parker had become a ghost, a man whose life had been scrutinized under a magnifying glass, yet still revealed nothing solid enough to hold. As investigators pushed harder, new rumors emerged from the town itself, whispers that pointed not just to Richard or Linda, but to forces outside the family entirely. And those whispers would send the investigation spiraling into even murkier waters. As the days turned into weeks, the Parker case began to drift from a straightforward investigation into a tangle of speculation. With no evidence to hold on to, no car, no ransom note, and no confirmed sightings, theories became the only currency people had to trade. And in a town where everyone knew each other's names, whispers spread fast. For investigators, this meant long nights spent in smoke-filled rooms, piecing together timelines that never seemed to align. They traced every phone call made from the Parker residence in the weeks before the disappearance. They logged every check written, every receipt found tucked away in drawers. Each discovery seemed ordinary on its own. Groceries purchased, school supplies bought, bills paid late, but detectives clung to them as if one scrap of paper might unlock the entire mystery. The first theory that took hold was the most straightforward, that Richard had simply buckled under the weight of his debts. Detectives imagined him driving the family out that night, perhaps with the intention of starting fresh somewhere far away. But as they searched for traces of new identities, motel receipts, or bank withdrawals in other towns, they found nothing. No credit cards were used, no money pulled from their accounts after June 14th. It was as if the Parkers had stepped off the map. The second theory was darker, that Richard had harmed his family himself. Detectives argued over this in hushed tones, some insisting that a man under such strain might have reached a breaking point. But again, there was no evidence. No signs of violence in the house, no trace of blood, no neighbors reporting screams or struggles that night. For others on the force, this made the theory feel too thin, too forced, as if it were built more on desperation than fact. Then came the theory that Linda had been the one to orchestrate their disappearance. Perhaps she had met someone, packed the children into the car, and convinced Richard to follow under false pretenses. This idea gained traction when a librarian mentioned seeing her with an unfamiliar man weeks before. But when detectives pressed for a description, nothing useful surfaced. Just vague memories, blurred by time and routine. Still, the possibility that Linda had been planning something lingered like smoke, impossible to clear. Outside the police station, the town developed theories of its own. Some whispered that the family had been kidnapped, taken by strangers passing through. This idea spread quickly among parents, who began clutching their children tighter at night, warning them not to talk to unfamiliar faces. Others speculated about the river. Everyone in town knew the winding stretch of water just outside the city limits, its sharp turns and narrow bridges. Rumors circulated that perhaps the Parkers' car had skidded off the road, plunging into the depths where no one could see. Local fishermen claimed the current was strong enough to carry away a vehicle, burying it in mud and weeds where it might remain invisible for decades. Police sent divers into shallow sections, but nothing surfaced. The deeper bends of the river, dark and dangerous, went unchecked. A fourth theory, though less popular, was that the Parkers had been running from something larger, perhaps connected to debts, gambling, or even criminal entanglements. Stories of organized crime, though rare in such a quiet town, began to circulate. A few insisted they had seen unfamiliar cars parked near the Parker home in the weeks before the disappearance, though no one could provide details. Detectives tried to follow each lead, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. Every theory had just enough weight to demand attention, but none had the strength to stand on its own. Meanwhile, the community grew restless. Candlelight vigils were held on the town green. Flyers with the family's faces stared out from gas station walls, their edges curling from the summer heat. Local reporters dug for scraps of information, publishing articles that leaned more on speculation than fact. For the relatives left behind, the theories were both a comfort and a torment. Each possibility gave them hope for answers, but each also carried pain. If Richard had harmed them, it meant betrayal. If Linda had run away, it meant abandonment. If it had been a stranger, it meant terror beyond imagination. There was no version of the truth that was not heartbreaking. By the end of that summer, the case had already taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just about the Parkers. It was about the unease that seeped into every corner of the community. Parents checked locks twice before bed. Children whispered about ghosts in the river. And behind the closed doors of the police station, detectives began to realize that unless something tangible was found, a car, a witness, a body, this case was at risk of going cold. But the town was not ready to let it go. Theories, still, spread, and the river whispers grew louder. And as autumn crept closer, the Parker mystery was already on its way to becoming legend. By the end of that long summer, when search parties had combed through fields and barns, when door-to-door questioning had turned up nothing more than conflicting memories, one theory remained stubbornly fixed in the minds of both investigators and townspeople alike: the river. The river had always been a presence in the community. It cut through the countryside like a dark vein, curving and twisting, its waters swelling in the spring and shrinking in the dry months. Children were warned not to swim too far from shore. Teenagers told stories of whirlpools and sunken logs that could drag a swimmer under. Fishermen spoke of losing nets to its unseen pull. The Parker family, like everyone else, would have crossed its bridges countless times. And now more and more people began to wonder, had the river taken them? It was a simple, almost comforting explanation. Unlike theories of violence or betrayal, the river offered an accident. Tragic, yes, but accidental all the same. People whispered it to one another in grocery aisles and church pews. Maybe Richard had been tired that night. Maybe the headlights of another car had blinded him on one of the narrow bends. Maybe the yellow sedan had slipped silently off the road, vanishing into the current, settling in mud where no one could see. Detectives could not ignore it. They brought in divers during the early weeks of the search, sending them into the shallower sections where visibility allowed. Men in wetsuits slipped into the murky water, feeling along the bottom with their hands, emerging with handfuls of weeds and rusted scrap, but nothing more. Boats dragged sonar equipment across calmer stretches, their screens lighting up with blips that turned out to be nothing but debris. Still, the river loomed. Its deepest bends remained untouched, places where currents twisted so fiercely that even experienced divers balked at the thought of descending. Old-timers shook their heads knowingly and muttered that anything swallowed by the river would never be found again. As weeks turned into months, the Parker house stood empty. The children's schoolbooks gathered dust, their shoes remained tucked beneath the couch, and the yard grew wild. But at the edge of town, families would slow their cars as they crossed the bridges, staring down into the black water. Some swore they saw glimmers of metal beneath the surface. Others claimed to hear sounds at night, the echo of a car door slamming, the faint cry of a child carried on the wind. The police received dozens of calls. A fisherman reported seeing something large and unnatural caught between two logs. A farmer swore he spotted the outline of a roof, just below the waterline. Each tip sent investigators back to the river with boats and lights, combing every inch they could reach. Each time, they came back empty-handed. But the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. To many in the town, the Parker case was no longer just a mystery. It was a haunting. Parents would warn their children not to linger near. The water after dark, saying the river already had its victims and was always hungry for more. Teenagers dared each other to stand on the bridge at midnight, staring into the depths until their nerves cracked. And even detectives, hardened men and women trained to deal in facts, found themselves uneasy whenever their patrol routes took them along the riverbank. It was too easy to picture the yellow sedan sitting silently in the muck below, its headlights still glowing in the imagination, its windows filled with the faces of a family frozen in time. Inside the station, the case board remained covered with photographs and strings, theories crisscrossing like spiderwebs. Yet one simple note seemed to overshadow all others. Check the river. It was written in thick black marker, circled twice. But for all their attempts, the river refused to give up its secrets. And as autumn bled into winter, the whispers hardened into something else: resignation. Maybe the Parkers would never be found. Maybe the river had claimed them, and maybe that was all anyone would ever know. Yet beneath that resignation, there lingered another feeling: dread. Because for some, the river was too neat an explanation, too convenient. If the Parkers were there, why hadn't they been found? If they weren't, then where were they? The questions lingered, unanswered, as the investigation dragged into another year. And with each passing season, the Parker mystery transformed from a police case into something larger, something woven into the fabric of the town itself. A legend whispered by those who couldn't forget. As the seasons turned and another year passed, the Parker case began to shift from an active investigation into something more elusive, a lingering wound that refused to close. The police had followed every tangible lead, searched the woods, dragged ponds, walked cornfields in neat, desperate lines, and interviewed anyone who might have known the family. Each time they believed they were closing in on an answer, it dissolved into nothing. And so, by the early 1980s, the Parker file moved from the front of the detectives' desks into the thick, dust-lined shelves reserved for cold cases. But silence does not mean forgetting. In town, the absence of the Parkers weighed heavily, a ghost that lingered in everyday routines. Their empty house became a quiet landmark, the curtains drawn, the paint beginning to peel, the lawn now taken over by weeds. Neighbors who once waved at Linda from their porches found themselves crossing the street to avoid looking at the darkened windows. Children whispered that the place was haunted, daring each other to run up and knock on the front door. Some swore that on certain nights they could still see a light flicker on inside, though no one lived there anymore. At school, the teachers still remembered Anna and Michael. Their classmates grew older, moved on to higher grades, but their names remained on the lips of those who had once shared desks and playgrounds with them. One girl recalled how Anna had promised to write her a letter over the summer, a letter that never came. Another boy still remembered Michael's laughter as he swung a bat during recess, the sound silenced forever by that June night. Their absence became a reminder of how fragile life could be, how quickly normal could turn into nightmare. Theories continued to circulate, passed around at church gatherings, whispered in the corners of diners, repeated late at night over beers in quiet kitchens. Some clung to the belief that the Parkers had simply run away, that somewhere in some distant town, they were alive under new names, living a different life. Others held tighter to the river theory, convinced that the water still hid the truth beneath its shifting currents. But a darker camp began to emerge, too. Those who believed that someone in town knew more than they were admitting. Every time a new family moved into the area, the story of the Parkers was retold to them, like a cautionary tale. That's the house where the family vanished, someone would explain. No one knows what happened, and no one ever will. The mystery began to harden into legend, a story that seemed less like a crime and more like a shadow cast over the entire community. For the Parker relatives, silence was unbearable. Linda's parents aged quickly in the years after her disappearance, their faces marked by grief and unanswered questions. They placed ads in regional newspapers, begging for tips, offering rewards, clinging to hope that someone somewhere might know what happened. Richard's brother grew bitter, refusing to speak to reporters anymore, snapping that they only cared about headlines and not the truth. Holidays passed with empty chairs at the table. Birthdays came and went with no candles to blow out. And yet, despite the silence, the case was never entirely dead. Every few years, a new detective would inherit the file, flipping through its thick pages of interviews, photographs, and reports. Each time, they would feel the same pull. There had to be something they were missing. They would chase down a rumor, re-interview a witness, and send divers back into the water. And each time, the result was the same: nothing. But the absence of answers only deepened the grip the case had on the community, because silence is its own kind of presence. It lingered in the spaces where laughter used to echo, in the locked filing cabinets at the station, in the glances exchanged by neighbors who still wondered if the truth lay much closer than anyone dared to admit. The 1980s turned into the 1990s, then the early 2000s. New tragedies and new headlines came and went, but the Parker family remained frozen in 1979. Their smiling photographs, once printed in newspapers and tacked onto telephone poles, faded and yellowed with time. And still, the question endured: where had they gone? And perhaps more hauntingly, would the truth ever be found? By the early 2000s, the Parker family's disappearance had become less a case file and more a ghost story. New detectives on the force knew the names, knew the outlines, but the details had grown hazy with time. The yellow sedan, the summer of 1979. The unanswered phone calls, they were fragments of a puzzle long since pushed to the back of the shelf. For younger officers, the case was something they had grown up hearing about as children, a chilling story passed down more than an open file to be solved. But cold cases have a way of resurfacing. In 2003, the county launched a new initiative to re-examine unsolved disappearances. Advances in technology meant that evidence once considered useless could now be analyzed in ways unthinkable decades earlier. DNA testing, digital archives, and improved sonar imaging all gave investigators new tools. And in the stack of cases handed over to the task force, the Parker file stood out. Not just because it was unsolved, but because of what it represented: an entire family gone without a trace. A mystery that had cast its shadow for more than 20 years. Detective Marlene Harris, assigned to lead the review, admitted later that she felt a chill the first time she opened the file. The photographs of the smiling children, the fading notes scrawled by officers who had long since retired, the maps with red pins marking dead-end searches, it all felt heavier than paper should. You could feel the weight of everyone who had touched it before me, she recalled. It wasn't just a case, it was a wound. Harris and her team began the painstaking process of going through every detail again. They read the transcripts of interviews, looking for contradictions. They checked property records, hoping to catch a missed lead. They traced family connections, searching for anyone who might have harbored resentment or a secret grudge. Most importantly, they turned their attention back to the rumor that had haunted the case for decades: the river. By then, sonar imaging had advanced dramatically. What divers in 1979 had been unable to see, machines in 2003 could now scan with clarity. The idea electrified both the investigators and the community. Local papers published fresh headlines. Could the Parker mystery finally be solved? Television crews arrived to cover the renewed search. Their cameras focused on boats gliding across the water, screens glowing in the cabins as they scanned the depths. The town, which had long resigned itself to never knowing, stirred back to life. People gathered on the banks, watching the search unfold. Some brought folding chairs and coolers, as if it were a sporting event. Others stood silently, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the water as though daring it to finally give up its secret. For many, this was not just about solving a case. It was about lifting a weight that had pressed down on them for nearly a generation. But the search was not quick. Days stretched into weeks as the sonar equipment revealed hundreds of shapes beneath the surface. Each blip had to be checked. Divers lowered into the water, only to come back with nothing more than sunken logs, rusted appliances, or piles of stone. The Parker car remained elusive, as if the river itself was determined to keep its grip on the truth. Still, the renewed investigation brought new energy. Tips began to flow in again, some from people who had remained silent for decades. A man came forward claiming he had seen headlights on the riverbank late that night in 1979, but he admitted he had been drinking and couldn't trust his own memory. Another woman swore she had overheard Richard arguing with someone at a gas station days before the family vanished, though she could no longer remember who it was. Most of the tips went nowhere, but they reignited the old suspicions. Once again, Richard's debts, Linda's rumored restlessness, the children's innocent disappearance, all of it was picked apart in newspapers, on television, and in late-night conversations at the local diner. Once again, the town was gripped by theories. And then, after months of searching, the sonar revealed something different. A shape, buried deep in one of the river's bends. Larger than the usual debris, more structured, more metallic. The divers prepared to go down again. And for the first time in decades, it felt as though the Parker family might finally be found. The discovery began with a blur on a sonar screen. At first, it looked no different from the dozens of other shapes that had pulled the divers' attention in the weeks before. A shadow, an outline, sitting silent in the bend of the river where the current twisted violently. But as the boat circled above it, sending scan after scan down into the depths, the shape remained stubbornly clear. It was long. It was boxy. It was the size of a car. For the investigators who had spent years chasing ghosts, the moment was electrifying. They didn't say it aloud, not yet, but everyone on that boat understood the possibility. After decades of whispers and speculation, the Parker family might finally be waiting just beneath them. The divers prepared carefully. The river at that bend was not forgiving. The current was unpredictable, visibility close to zero. Even the most experienced divers knew the risks. And yet, there was no hesitation. This was what the case had always come down to, the river. The question was whether the water would finally surrender its secret. As the divers slipped into the current, onlookers gathered on the banks. Word had spread quickly through town, and soon the river was lined with cars and small crowds. People leaned on guardrails, holding their breath as if they could will the divers to the bottom. Some clutched photographs of the Parker family, yellowed and creased from years of handling. Others stood silently, their faces pale with anticipation and fear. Down below, the divers fought their way into the bend, their lights slicing through murky water thick with silt and weeds. For a moment, there was nothing but shadows. Then, slowly a shape began to emerge, curved metal, the faint glint of chrome, buried under mud. Their hands brushed against the edge of a bumper. And then, with the sweep of a flashlight, the truth became undeniable. It was a car. The divers surfaced with the news, their voices clipped, professional, but their faces gave them away. The crowd erupted with gasps, some clutching one another, others covering their mouths in shock. The investigators on the boat exchanged glances, heavy with years of expectation. They radioed for equipment, for ropes, for cranes. The river had held on to the car for more than 2 decades, and now it was about to rise. The process was slow. Winches strained against the weight of years. Cables groaned as mud and water fought to keep the vehicle buried. Inch by inch, the car broke free from the river's grasp. First the roof, caked in silt. Then the windshield, shattered but intact enough to reveal the dark emptiness inside. Finally, the body of the car emerged, rusted and broken, dripping with weeds like. The river itself was reluctant to let go. The yellow paint, once bright, was now muted and mottled with rust, but there was no mistaking it. This was the Parker family's car. For a long moment, silence gripped the crowd. No one cheered. No one spoke. The reality of the discovery was too heavy. Parents pulled their children closer, as if shielding them from the sight. Elderly neighbors wept openly, remembering the family who had once waved to them from their porch, now reduced to a ghost pulled from the water. The car was placed onto the shore, surrounded by police tape and floodlights. Investigators approached it with careful steps, notebooks in hand, cameras flashing. Inside the vehicle, time had left its mark. The upholstery had rotted away, the dashboard cracked, the steering wheel warped. And yet, despite the decay, the car was more than a relic. It was a tomb. When the doors were forced open, a smell of damp earth and riverweed rushed out. And there, inside, lay the remains of the Parker family. 2 small skeletons in the back seat, an adult in the passenger seat, another behind the wheel. The investigators froze, the air heavy with the weight of confirmation. For more than 2 decades, the Parkers had been the subject of rumor and theory, suspicion and debate. And now, here they were. Not runaways, not abducted, not hidden away under new names. They had been here all along, in the river that had been whispered about. From the very beginning, the discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Television crews arrived within hours, broadcasting images of the rusted car pulled onto the shore, the headlights dull with age, the license plate still faintly legible beneath layers of mud. For families who had lived under the shadow of the mystery for so long, it was almost too much to comprehend. The Parkers were found, and yet their discovery raised more questions than it answered. Because as investigators looked closer at the wreck, doubts began to creep in. The angle of the car, the position of the bodies, the condition of the windows, they didn't quite fit with the idea of a simple accident. The river had given up the Parkers, but it had not given up the truth. Not yet. For investigators, the discovery of the Parker family's car should have been the ending. After more than 2 decades of unanswered questions, the vehicle and the remains inside, it should have finally closed the file. But in truth, the moment the car was pulled from the river, the mystery only deepened. The first problem was the position of the vehicle. When cars slide off rural roads into rivers, the patterns are usually predictable. They follow the slope of the embankment, the trajectory carrying them into the water nose first. But the Parker sedan had been found at an angle that didn't make sense. It wasn't lined up with the nearest curve in the road. In fact, to end up where it did, the car would have had to travel against the current, as though it had been placed there intentionally or dragged by some force that investigators couldn't explain. Then there were the windows. 2 of them were rolled down. In most accidental drownings, panic causes passengers to claw at the doors or try to break glass in a desperate attempt to escape. Here, however, the windows had been rolled down neatly, as though someone had lowered them willingly before the car sank. What could that mean? Had they seen something? Tried to call for help? Or had someone else been in control of the vehicle that night? Inside the car, the remains told their own grim story. The skeletons of the children, Anna and Michael, lay in the back seat, their small bones still partially wrapped in fragments of fabric. In the front, the adult remains were seated as though frozen mid-journey, one in the passenger side, one in the driver's seat. Richard, it seemed, had been behind the wheel, Linda beside him. But their positions didn't fit cleanly. The passenger's seat was reclined farther than expected, as if someone had been pushed back or slumped there before the car entered the water. The coroner's office, working carefully, began the long process of examining the bones. Though the years in the river had washed away much of the evidence, certain details remained. Small fractures on the ribs of one of the adults, a healed break in Linda's wrist from years earlier. The children's bones showed no obvious signs of trauma, but the adult skeletons raised troubling questions. Were the fractures the result of the crash, or did they suggest something else had happened before the car ever touched the water? Detectives combed the interior for artifacts. A rusted wristwatch still clung to Richard's arm. A child's shoe, impossibly small, lay wedged beneath the driver's seat. On the floor, half buried in muck, they found the remains of a purse. Inside, remarkably preserved, were a few coins, a faded photograph of the children, and a set of keys that didn't seem to match any door in the Parker home. The forensic team also noticed something unusual. The car's headlights were in the on position, even though the battery had long since died. This detail struck them. Why would Richard have been driving with his lights on in the middle of summer when the sun hadn't fully set? Was it possible the family had gone into the river later than originally believed, perhaps after dark? If so, what had delayed them that long on their way to his sister's house? As the evidence mounted, so did the unease. To the families of Richard and Linda, the discovery brought grief, but also relief. At least now they could lay their loved ones to rest. But to investigators, the car was not closure. It was a question mark made of rust and bone. When the findings were presented publicly, the community once again erupted with speculation. Some clung to the accident theory, insisting that Richard must have lost control on a dangerous bend. Others pointed to the rolled-down windows and strange angle of the car, whispering that someone must have forced them off the road. And still, others believed in a more chilling scenario, that the family had already been dead before the car touched the water, their disappearance staged to look like an accident. Detective Harris, leading the renewed investigation, voiced what many of her colleagues were already thinking. "The car gives us answers," she said, "but it also gives us something worse, more contradictions. If this was an accident, it wasn't a typical one. And if it wasn't an accident, then someone went to great lengths to make it look like one." The Parker family had been found, but the truth of what happened on that summer night in 1979 was still hidden, wrapped in shadows that even the river could not wash away. The Parker car had been pulled from the river. The remains had been identified. After more than 2 decades of silence, the family was no longer missing. But if the discovery brought a measure of closure, it also reopened wounds that many had tried to bury, and soon old suspicions began to resurface. The first suspect, in many eyes, had always been Richard himself. The burden of his debts, his short temper, the whispers from coworkers who described him as a man under pressure, all of it made him the easy target of speculation. Had he driven his family into the river intentionally, overwhelmed by financial ruin? Some believed it, convinced that the rolled-down windows and strange positioning of the car pointed to a deliberate act. But others pushed back. They remembered Richard as a loving father, a man who brought his children to Sunday school, who worked double shifts to keep food on the table. Could that same man have chosen to end it all with his family in the back seat? Then there was Linda. Her name had surfaced in rumors years before, when a librarian claimed to have seen her speaking to an unfamiliar man. The sighting, vague as it was, had planted a seed that grew with time. Some now argued that Linda may have planned to leave Richard, and that the confrontation that night spiraled out of control. But no evidence ever supported the claim. The man she supposedly met was never identified. And when Linda's remains were recovered beside her husband's, her story ended not as a runaway, but as another victim. Other theories turned outward. Neighbors spoke of Richard's debts, of loan sharks and angry creditors. Some wondered if the family had crossed the wrong person, if someone had forced them into the river to settle a score. Yet investigators could find no evidence of such ties. The Parkers lived modestly, their troubles more mundane than sinister. And while suspicions flared, they faded just as quickly under the weight of time. The discovery of the car raised another possibility, one that investigators struggled to ignore. What if the Parkers had been victims of something no one in town could have predicted? An accident, yes, but not the simple kind. A confrontation on the road. Another vehicle forcing them off the bridge. A driver who never came forward. These questions hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Forensic experts gave their opinions, but the years in the river had erased too much. The fractures on Richard's ribs, the rolled-down windows, the car's strange angle. None of it added up cleanly, but none of it could prove foul play either. The river had preserved the family, but it had washed away the truth. And so, in the end, the Parker case closed not with answers, but with shadows. The remains were returned to their relatives, and the family was laid to rest in a cemetery not far from the home they had once lived in. The community gathered, decades older now, to say goodbye to the family they had lost in their youth. Flowers lined the graves. Children who had once been classmates now stood as adults, Heads bowed. Closure, of a kind, had come. But peace remained. Out of reach, because questions still lingered. Why had the car been at such an unnatural angle in the river? Why were the windows rolled down? Why had no one seen or heard anything that night? The Parker mystery, even in its ending, refused to be solved completely. It remained what it had always been, a story of absence, of speculation, of shadows that refused to lift. And for the town, the image of that rusted yellow car being pulled from the water became its own kind of legend. Proof that secrets can remain hidden for decades. Proof that the answers we wait for may never come cleanly. And proof, perhaps most hauntingly of all, that even when the missing are found, the truth can still remain out of reach. The Parker family vanished in 1979. 30 years later, the river revealed their fate. But the truth of what happened on that summer night may never be known.